Welcome everyone to our webinar today, Understanding the Visa Rules. What a way to finish the year and understanding the one thing that kept us going the entire year. So I'm Charles with Bishota Law, and my colleague Nicole Pirog is going to be joining us remotely. And we really are very thrilled to have you here today. We're proud to have this webinar because with our friends at Reeve and Basnett, we always try to make sure that we have an education content that comes to you guys. And the idea is to go ahead and make your life easy and our life easy, because it seems like our day is involved with some sort of visa rules in the morning or afternoon. So we're very excited today that Robert Johnson agreed to come back and speak with us and educate with us. If you recall, Robert is the Senior Director of Visa Rules Management. And during this webinar, we really just wanted Robert to give us a walk around from the card brand perspective, because as you know, when you work in this space, everybody talks about the rules and point to card brand rules, but really most of us don't really know until you have some sort of enforcement assessment or something comes up with your merchants. And our hope is by the end of this call, we are happy and jolly because we'll be experts on visa rules. Robert, before we jump in, I just wanted to make sure that we are very clear. Today's webinar is for educational purpose. Nothing we're going to discuss today should be regarded as legal advice. If you have any legal questions on any content we discuss today, please contact your representative law firm, and we'll always be more than happy to help you. We are glad you're here and hope you find this session very useful. The webinar is being recorded and we will be making it available after. And I'm going to be turning it over to Ashley to introduce our guest speaker. Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you, Charles. Everyone, it's my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker for today's webinar, Mr. Robert Johnson. He brings a wealth of experience and knowledge from his extensive career in the payments industry, particularly with Visa. Robert has been with Visa for over 18 years, and currently he is serving as head of Visa Rules Management for North America. And in this role, he oversees the largest region by payment volume for Visa, focusing on rule development, compliance enforcement, and ensuring the integrity of Visa transactions. His belief that the happiness of cardholders and merchants drives mutual success is at the core of his work. Robert is known for his commitment to enhancing business success through intelligent use of technology and digital retail. He also understands the value of great user experience and has a proven track record in this area. With over 30 years in the card payments industry, he has developed a deep understanding for the intricacies of payment systems. And his previous role as director of EMV contact chip and contactless payments at Visa saw him leading the implementation of business rules for Visa EMV contact chip and Visa PayWave contactless payment products. Say that 3 times fast. Before his current tenure at Visa, Robert was a dispute executive and project manager at Visa Europe, where he honed his skills in payment systems and dispute resolution. And today he's going to share his insights and expertise on the Visa rules, drawing from his experience in rule management and compliance. His perspective is certainly invaluable for anyone looking to navigate the complexities of Visa rules and regulations. So please join me in warmly welcoming Mr. Robert Johnson to our webinar.
Thank you very much, Ashley. Thank you, Charles. Appreciate the kind introduction. Yes, it's actually been, when you add on my time in Visa Europe and Visa US, it's actually now coming up on 24 years with the company. So I don't know what I get for that, but it's been a while. Okay, so I'm going to kick off the PowerPoint. Hopefully, full screen. Oh, come on. Hold on. There we go. Okay, you should be seeing the full screen now. And let me know if not.
Yes, you got it.
Okay, excellent. All right, thank you very much. Yeah, well, yeah, again, I really appreciate the opportunity to come and speak to everyone here on this. Just to get the notice of confidentiality out of the way, and as Charles mentioned about it's not legal advice. The presentation actually is all based upon public information, even though it's marked as confidential. The rules The majority of the rules themselves are confidential or actually are public document now. The foundation, or actually rather what we're going to cover today. Let me give you the background of why I developed this presentation. Been approached on numerous occasions over the last few years by both clients and, believe it or not, many internal visa staff about a need to dive deeper into the rules, about how to use them. And what I sort of assembled over the last couple of years is a series of common questions around the rules, which is what we're going to touch on today. So what are they? How and when do we publish? Where do you find the updates? What is the difference between the core rules and the product and service rules? How do we structure the book? Key elements of a rule, what the appendix, what the glossary do. I'm going to talk about some key visa rules, how we do enforcement, which, as Ashley and Charles know, are a very important part of the rules process. Also touch briefly on another public document, which is the Visa Merchant Data Standards Rule. And then as a result of one of these presentations, I was asked to explain how people can file complaints with Visa. And so I've got a slide on that. And then lastly, where one can go for additional information. So it should take about 40 minutes, so there'll be time for questions afterwards if people have them. So let's start with this. What are the Visa rules? Essentially, they are a contract between Visa and its clients. And basically, when joining Visa, one agrees to not just follow the Visa rules, but you're also signing essentially a trademark license agreement. And these rules set out the obligation and rights of all participants in the payment standards system, including the minimum standards to which participants must comply. They set out a series of core policies for issuers, acquirers, agents, merchants, other entities like payment facilitators, and to how they will interact on the payment networks. They help us operate as a single company and a single brand. We're a payment network for all stakeholders. They minimize system risks, provide common, convenient, secure, and reliable global payments experience. But they also support unique geographic needs as well. The second to last part, I can't overemphasize. If I was to boil it down to one purpose for the rules, or having the rules, is so that as a Visa card holder, one can jump on a plane to another state or even another country, and if the merchant displays the Visa acceptance mark and you have a Visa card and your account is in good standing, you can simply tap or dip or swipe your card, if old school, give a signature or PIN or even no signature and PIN, and walk away with goods and services. And that merchant can offer those goods and services safe in the knowledge that they will also get paid. And it's that single payment experience that underpins the Visa brand, and why the rules and compliance with them is so important. Now, how often, when, and where do we publish? So we do have a biannual publication cycle. So we publish new versions of the rules both in mid-April and mid-October. The specific date aligns with Visa's business enhancements release. It's generally somewhere between the 13th and the 19th of the month. But it coincides with that. And as I say, we do publish twice a month. I'll show you later how you can identify very easily if you're looking at the latest version. It isn't just the name on the cover. But if you're looking at an extract of rules, there's a way to find out which version it is. Staying up to date with the most recent rules is absolutely critical. And I was actually working with a client a couple of weeks ago, and they were showing how they're promoting compliance, and on their webpage for their merchants to land to, they have a copy of the Visa rules, the MasterCard rules, and the Amex rules. Difference being that the Visa rules was a 2.5-year-old version that they had on there. And I was able to work with them so that it's constantly updated with the new version. But looking at the most recent rules is critical. They are published both on Visa Online and on Visa.com. Visa Online is just for Visa clients. You need a specific sign-on for that. But they are published on Visa.com. Very importantly, and probably the big takeaway here, is there are two versions of the rules. There is a confidential version for Visa participants. Those are licensees of the Visa network, and there is a public version which has an approximate 5% redaction. The rules that have been redacted really revolve around safety and security. I would say if you're looking at day-to-day business, almost certainly the public version of the rules has more than enough content, and that the differences that you'll see are very unlikely to impact day-to-day operations. But there is a public version on visa.com, and I'll show you later on where to find that. Now, as I mentioned, we do publish twice a year. What that means is, or the reason we publish twice a year is because we are constantly changing the books. Every year we have, every publication, we have approximately 60 rule change proposals that get processed in that interim period and then get published in the version of the book that we issue. So the first section, I recommend people do this with every new publication, is go to what we call here, that we refer to as the SOC, the summary of changes. It's the very first section of the book. And here you will find all the changes categorized by region. You'll find a brief description of the change. You'll find an effective date of the change. You'll find links to every rule that was impacted by the change, and you'll find a link to the Visa Business News article that announced the change. Now, just to be clear, that last bullet is only for the confidential version, not for the public version. But if you have a look at the image I've taken from the book on the right, this is the start of the summary of changes, and you'll notice the blue text along the top, separated or just above the table. That's a hypertext link. If you click on that, it will take you to that section. Now, to be clear, if you are working and you're dealing with merchants only in the North America region, or actually, let's just say US region, be more specific, you can click just on the US tab and it will take you to that rules section. But you should be aware the first tab, which says global or multi-regional, there will likely be, well, not likely, there will definitely be changes in that section that also affect US clients. So I'd say go to the global multi-regional section to look at those changes. And again, if you're only dealing with US, then just click on the US tab. There's no need to look at SAMEA or the European changes. And you can see there in the columns, you have the region that's applicable to, you see a title of the change. Each rule that is impacted and updated as a result of that change, that too is a hypertext link. You click on that, it will take you straight to that rule in the book. And there you can see as well, this is the confidential version. There's a link to the VBN. And to see the VBN, one needs to be logged into Vol. But if you're logged into Vol, Visa Online, it will take you straight through to that version. But that's my recommendation. If you take one thing away from this presentation, is every time you get the new rule book is published, go to the SOC and just see what's changed. If it hasn't changed, it won't be mentioned in the summary of changes. That means the rule is the same as last time. And again, I'll show you a trick how you can look at a rule and see when it was last changed. What's the difference between a core rule and a product and service rule? Well, we have a rule for that. The core rules essentially set out fundamental principles that apply to all system-specific participants, specify minimum requirements, uphold safety and security and soundness and integrity and interoperability of the Visa system. Hence, they're core rules. They're undoubtedly the most critical rules. The product and service rules, however, they are often based on a specific product or service or something like a dispute process. They may not be global. There is a lot more regional rules in the product and service rules, but they are very much more sort of opt-in type rules in many instances. But that is defined within our rules. And yeah, I could have pressed the button earlier and come up with those. So, structure of the rules. Again, I just mentioned the difference between the core rules and product and service rules. You'll see here on the left, these boxes, Chapter 1, Visa Core Rules. You'll notice actually just in front of that, Summary of Changes. Like I said, it's the very first section of the book. But Chapter 1 is the core rules. And then you have the product and service rules of Chapter 2 onwards. And a very, again, common misconception that I see is people think, oh, I'm interested in acceptance rules. So they go to chapter 5 because it's labeled acceptance. However, one should be aware that there are core acceptance rules in chapter 1. And you can see here where I've expanded chapter 1. You can see chapter 1.5 is acceptance. So if you're looking for rules related to a subject, always go to chapter 1, look at the core rules for that subject before you then go to the products and service chapter for that particular subject. So if you want to see, for example, if there's a rule saying a merchant cannot establish a minimum amount, you would start with chapter 1.5. It's an acceptance rule. If it's not there, then check chapter 5 for the regular acceptance product and service rules. Again, probably the most common issue, or people will approach me internally at Visa and say, I can't find a rule for this. I've looked everywhere in chapter 5. Someone told me it was in the book, but I can't find it. And the reality is they should be looking in chapter 1.5. That's, if they're looking for a core rule, that's where they will find it. Now I talked about potentially tips on how to read a rule. So there's a couple of things that are important here. As I mentioned, we're constantly evolving our rules. We change about 60 subjects a year, per publication. So 120 subjects a year. Some of those will be one rule. Some of them can be up to 30 rules. So it doesn't mean 60 rules. It could mean 200 or 300 rules that get changed per publication. So we need a method of phasing in and out rules. So you will see that the old rule will have an effective through date and a new rule will have an effective from date. So in this instance, you can see here, this is the October 23 publication. This top rule was effective through 13th of October 2023. The new rule below it replaces it, effective 14th of October 2023. Now, as to how they become effective, often it's to do with the transaction date. So if it relates specifically to a transaction, if the transaction occurs on or before the 13th of October 23, that rule will apply to it. If it is after, then it's the second rule, the new rule. Sometimes it may just be any activity you do, any dispute you raise on or after this date, the new rule applies. So you have to look at the context of the rule to see exactly how and when that date applies. But generally, if it's talking about transactions, then it's the transaction date. So I mentioned the effective dates. Again, transaction date or central processing date if it gets delayed processing. I mentioned about how you find about newer and older rules. Well, one of the key things we hear, and again, as I mentioned, because we publish the rulebook every month, these chapter references, so this one, 1.1.8.52, they change. They change between publications. We may have deleted the rule before it, and so the next publication, this could be 1.1.8.51. It could be that we move it entirely to a different section. So I would never rely on quoting the chapter references when looking at a rule. What you want to do is look at the rule ID. We refer to this here as the node. This rule stays the same no matter where this rule sits in the book. So if you've been unfortunate enough to receive a compliance case from Visa, you will note that Visa states we will be quoting the rule ID. We won't be quoting the chapter reference. So we will say, the violation is rule, let's say 8752, which is valid and accurate data. So we'll be citing that reference. And so that gives you a much better way of finding old rules back in older books. As well as that, it's very important, I mentioned, to make sure you're looking at the right book, look at the edition version. So again, sometimes people send me rules and they say, I've looked at the Visa rules and it says we can do this, but someone just told me we can't. And I'll say, well, send me the actual screenshot of the rule you're looking at. And the first thing I do is I go to the edition number, and you'll be amazed how many times I get sent a rule from the 2020 book or even a 2019 book. And so, it's really important that you're making sure that you're referencing the current version of the rules. The last piece here, fairly obvious, but last updated. What's that? Why that's really useful? It gives you an element of version control. If you're looking at a rule and you wonder how long it's been in place, if it says last updated, April 2019, that doesn't mean that was when the rule was implemented. It meant that's the last time it's been amended in some way. But you know, at least since April 2019, that rule has remained untouched and is in its current form with no fundamental changes. So those are really important tips for kind of understanding and navigating through the book. I mentioned all the chapters for the PSRs. We do actually have two other chapters, the Appendix A and the glossary. I'll come to the glossary after this, but the Appendix A contains what we call the visa supplemental requirements documents. These are basically extension or third-party administered documents. They're owned by Visa, but they're generally more product specific. If you were to click on the tab for Appendix A at the front of the book, it would take you through to this section, and you can see here some examples. So there's one of the supplemental requirements documents is 3D secure functional requirements for the access control server, ACS. That's a highly technical document. And as a result, the contents of that do not need to go into the main rulebook. If we mandate the use that service, then that will be in the main rulebook. But in terms of how to deploy, how it functions, and how to maintain the ACS, that would be where you would go to the Visa supplemental requirements document. Again, all those are hypertext. If you're signed into Vol, Visa Online, you click on that and it'll enable you to download that document. These, from an enforceability point of view, these have the same enforceability level as a PSR. So anything in Chapter 2 onwards is enforceable. Anything in these documents, if it's stated as essentially a requirement, it is technically enforceable through compliance as well. There are about 280-ish VSR documents, which I know is a lot, but they are also right the way across the product spectrum. So depending on what you're doing, you'll probably only likely need to access only a few of those. So I talked about the appendix. Let's talk about the glossary. So the last section of the book, it contains the definitions of any capitalized words and provides a greater explanation of what they are. So again, start the glossary. You'll notice you've got 0 all the way through Z, A through Z as well. You can click on any of those. If you click on M, it will take you to the M section. So that is a smart link. And to give you a really good example here, here is the definition, a glossary term of the word card. Now, you see we define it as a payment card, digital application, or other device or solution that provides access to a payment credential and that is capable of conducting a transaction, is issued by an issuer, and may bear one of the Visa-owned marks. The reason that exists, and the reason I wanted to highlight this was, as we move beyond the medium of physical plastics into provision technologies like our Garmin's and smartphones, we recognize that it would be quite word intensive to call out every single one of those every time we mention the word card within the rules. That would be a lot of additional wording in the rules and unnecessary. So instead, we expanded the definition of card to mean something other than a physical plastic. So that's why it's critical when one is reading the rules, if you see a capitalized term like card, like transaction, and you want to really understand what that means, go to the glossary. You want to look up the word transaction, click on the word T, and then go through. You might be easier to click on U and then scroll backwards, but it'll explain in more details. So understanding the glossary terms and knowing when a word is capitalized that it has a greater definition within the rules is another critical element to being able to fully understand them. So highly recommend dipping in and out of the glossary as you read the rules, because it adds that extra layer of detail. Now let's just talk about some key rules. Honor all cards. That is the rule that says to a merchant, if you have a Visa flag, you display the Visa flag, you must accept all Visa cards properly presented for payment. What that means is if a merchant is unhappy, say with Chase because they had their house foreclosed on, a merchant cannot arbitrarily decide they will no longer accept Chase Visa cards. They have to honor all cards. Now, in the same context, we have IREIT, the issuer requirement to evaluate each transaction. That essentially puts the same requirement on our issuers, which essentially says, if you are issuing Visa cards to cardholders, you cannot arbitrarily block all legal transactions. Now, issuers can risk score transactions. Obviously, they don't need to approve transactions if the cardholder is delinquent or over their credit limit. But if an issuer decides pure and simply that they don't like cryptocurrency, they cannot arbitrarily decide that they will block any cryptocurrency purchase made by their cardholders. They can certainly risk score them, no issue with that, but they cannot implement a system block for what is a legal transaction. Now, if the transaction is not legal, then the issuer has no obligation to approve it. And indeed, an acquirer is required to not submit that transaction into VisaNet. But this is about legal transactions, and IREIT is the issuer equivalent of honor all cards. We have important rules about no cross-border issuing, no cross-border acquiring. We try and keep markets localized as much as possible. I mentioned about legality. We do have a rule that says local law always supersedes Visa rules. So a good example of that, which actually leads nicely into the next one, surcharging. In states that legally prohibit surcharging, and which would be Connecticut, Oklahoma, Maine, and Massachusetts currently, New York by default has essentially prohibited surcharging. Even though our rules say you can surcharge, technically, because those states say you can't, that means their rule supersedes ours, and surcharging is not allowed in states where local law says it is not permitted. Another one that I mentioned here, discount offer, that is the Visa rule that says a merchant may offer an incentive to a cardholder to pay with an alternative payment method. And that can be a discount, it can be some sort of incentive, but that is the rule that allows a merchant to dual price and say the product is $20 on a Visa card, $19.50 on cash. And that is absolutely permitted. But that's another fundamental rule. If I were to take my compliance team's workload, 90% of it, or actually probably maybe 80%, is based around the incorrect application of those last two rules, surcharging and discount offers today. We've seen a massive uptick in compliance complaints about surcharging. Hence, we're very active in compliance in that space. But those two are the ones that really drive a lot of our work here in the compliance team at Visa. Let's talk about how do we, I can't actually read my title because the controls are blocking it. Does it say, how does Visa enforce its rules? I should remember I wrote this. So how do we enforce these? Well, we do two types of compliance. We have reactive compliance and proactive compliance. So reactive are the inbound complaints, the majority of which come from cardholders and issuers. We do occasionally get acquirers complaining. We occasionally get merchants complaining. Sometimes agents and agencies. We do get complaints from the Better Business Bureau, the CFPB occasionally. But I would say if I were to put them in percentages, over 90% come from issuers and cardholders. And as one can imagine, we do have a rule about compliance, which I put up on the screen. So that's our reactive compliance. I will say our compliance complaints about surcharging have gone from about 400 a year in about 2018 to almost 6,000 a year today. And that is because of this deployment of many non-compliant cash discount and surcharge models in the US market currently. Which also leads nicely onto our proactive compliance. So we do proactive compliance. This is where we look for compliance issues based on data research, mystery shopping. Our surcharge audit, which I mentioned earlier, is based on mystery shopping. We do look at exception reporting, and we do get compliance requests from internal groups at Visa. And again, we have a rule about how we can determine whether a violation of the rules occurred, and our rules do state our ability to assess non-compliance assessments if we see a lack of response to a compliance complaint or potentially repeat violations in market by the same merchant or the same client. I mentioned the Visa Merchant Data Standards Manual. This, you'll be pleased to know, this is purely a public document. We do publish this twice a year. This is a document maintained by my team. It provides detailed guidance on the following. Oops. Merchant location. So it has instructions on how you determine merchant location, i.e. where the location the merchant can claim as its primary business location within the Visa transaction, but also how one can acquire a merchant and whether they meet the qualification standards in your market. So a Chinese merchant, for example, cannot simply ring up a US acquirer and ask to be processed as a US merchant. They have to meet the qualification standards, pay taxes, have off staff in market, and so on. And those are detailed both here and also in the rule book. They talk about naming convention. We give some examples at the start of this book. If a farm gets developed into a parking lot, but it still retains the name of Johnson's Farm, for example, you want to make sure the merchant's name is Johnson's Farm Parking, not just Johnson's Farm, because that will likely lead to a potential recognition dispute with the issuer, which could lead to a financial dispute, what we used to refer to as chargeback, and all because the merchant naming, the name assigned to the merchant wasn't enough to trigger recognition with the cardholder. So we give guidance on that too. And then the last piece is, and the most important part, is merchant category code information. So I've used an example here, Wigan toothpaste stores. It breaks down, it has a column, 4 columns for each MCC, and the titles aren't showing here, but because I chose one in the middle of the row, but I want to give you an idea. First is the numeric. It's a 4-digit numeric. We agree these numerics with MasterCard, and some of them are driven by the International Standards Organization. MasterCard, interestingly, has, I think it's 9 additional MCCs that Visa does not support. We've no intention of supporting those same ones. We're not sure how much they get used, but generally they are the same. You're probably aware that airlines, hotels, and car rental agencies, if they have enough volume, enough hotel rooms, enough flights, or enough rental cars, they can apply for their own MCC, and we coordinate that with MasterCard to make sure we're not assigning a merchant different MCCs between networks. So there's your numeric. You then have the name and a descriptor of what the merchant does. It then also gives more detailed qualifying business lines for that merchant. And then most importantly, if you're not sure, the final column is what are similar MCCs. So it's possible if it doesn't fit exactly into this, it may fit into one of these other ones. And so those are really the purpose of the columns. MCC assignment remains a constant compliance issue. It always has been. Many times it's accidental. Sometimes it is deliberate, where a merchant is assigned a MCC that attracts a lower rate of interchange. And so we are very active in that space from the proactive compliance case situation. My team doesn't do that. Our global compliance team runs in-market MCC compliance around the world, and we constantly find significant results there and constantly forcing corrections. We are currently developing an AI driven tool. I saw the first demo of it yesterday that will actually find those issues for us. And so then we can raise cases based upon that. But MCC assignment is absolutely critical. It does affect it affects pricing, or it can affect pricing. It can affect rewards if an issuer is doing rewards on dining, but it gets coded as a supermarket. That could be a problem. It affects risk scoring in some instances. It can also therefore affect approval rates. And finally, it can affect dispute rights. So assigning the correct MCC is absolutely critical for all stakeholders, and is something that we're very active in enforcing. Now, I did mention earlier, I was asked when I gave this presentation in Albany, New York, in wintertime, it was very cold, that how do I file a complaint with Visa? And I was on stage later again during the day, so I put together this slide. So if you, as a consumer, and we're all consumers here, if you find you're getting surcharged and you get surcharged on a debit card transaction, you get a merchant insisting on ID, not required to insist on ID, a merchant that sets a minimum amount on a debit card. So you can set a minimum amount of $10 on credit, but if it's a minimum amount of $20 on credit, that's a violation. If the minimum amount applies to any debit card transaction, that's a violation. If you didn't get your rewards because the merchant category code is wrong, that's a violation. So you can report these to Visa, and this is how you do it. If you go to visa.com, and then if you just type the word rules into the search bar, it will come up with this rules and policy tab. You click on there, and if you look down in the middle bottom, just above the word overview, it says file an inquiry. You click on that, and as you can see here, it says report an in-store purchase issue. We're about to go through and update all this. We obviously know it's not always, it could be an online purchase where the issue has occurred. To be fair, though, the majority of them are in person, but we're going to make this a little bit more up to date. But you click on there, and then you can see here, there's a box you can fill in detailing the merchant issues. You can report merchants anonymously. You don't have to put your contact details. It is useful if we do have any follow-up questions. This page is also being updated, so you can include a transaction receipt or any images of signage if you wish. At the moment, it's just a physical report. We'll detailing, outlining in writing what the issue is, but that would be how you can do it. So it's a very simple process. Go to Visa Rules, or go to visa.com, type Visa Rules, click on File an Inquiry, and then you can report your purchase that way. Finally, this is my final slide, so we'll have time for questions. Where do you find out more? Obviously, it's going to be difficult to write down these links. If you just went to visa.com and typed in Visa Rules, on that same tab, you would find that I just showed you, you would find a link to download the Visa Rules. The Merchant Data Standards Manual, that's on the same page. You can just download it there as well. If you wanted guidance on surcharging, if you went to visa.com and typed in the word surcharge, it will take you to, it will provide a link where you can review our guidance around surcharging. And we also have a really useful FAQ there as one of those documents that you can benefit, read and review. And then the final port of call, if you have any questions, we do have an inbox, Visa Rules Inquiries at visa.com. If you do email them, don't tell them where you got that email address. They probably hate me already, but that's a useful source. Bear in mind, there is a 72-hour turnaround on that inbox. We do get a lot of inquiries through there. So, give it a couple of days before expecting a response if you can. And that is basically it. So I'll stop sharing now, and I'm happy to take any questions.
So we did not enable the ability for people to type in their questions, but what we did want to do is a couple of things. One, if anybody's watching this If they have any questions, they can email their respective firms, and we're happy to communicate with Robert and get some answers on things that may not have been clear throughout that presentation. But I did come up with a couple of questions as far
Sure.
as I think things that our clients would like to get some more information on. First and foremost, I did want to know if maybe you could share an update on where Visa is at with its efforts to help compliant surcharging, because I know that there was a various rollout of this process, and it's not something you guys have been doing for a short amount of time. So I wanted to see if you could provide an update on where Visa's at with all of that.
Yes, great question. So we are continuing with our audits. We've just got funded for the rest of calendar year 2025. So we're planning on continuing to audit through the year. I think overall we are seeing progress. We're seeing compliant models, more and more compliant models. We've updated our third-party agent registration process, which is where an acquirer would need to register an ISO who's offering a surcharge solution with Visa before they start working with them. And now when they register, they get asked a series of questions about if they offer surcharging or cash discounting. And if they answer yes to either or both, then they get asked a series of additional questions, which we use to validate whether or not it appears to be a compliant solution. That has helped greatly with deployment of invalid solutions into the market. We are, as I say, we are making progress. I will say it's been a lot slower than we anticipated. There's been a considerable resistance to moving to migrate compliant models, as well as that there has been a contagion effect where we're starting to see more and more merchants just start surcharging because they've seen other merchants surcharging. So they haven't been facilitated by any ISO or acquirer. They've just noticed as consumers, they were getting surcharged, or the convenience store down the street was surcharging, so they start doing it. And obviously that's a very dangerous situation to be in, because we have technical requirements about BIN validation to make sure debit cards aren't surcharged. We have caps on the surcharge. We also have a data element, field 28, that must be populated, and specific signage requirements. So to just start surcharging, you undoubtedly just walk straight into a compliance trap. And the penalties are significant. We charge $1,000 for every merchant that is on a compliance case. So if we open a valid compliance case, it's $1,000 case fee. If the situation isn't resolved in 30 days, or we don't get a valid request for an extension within that 30 days, depending on the aspect of surcharging they're violating, if it's signage, the fine is, say, $5,000. But if it's surcharge on debit, then that's a core rule. That's a $25,000 fine. So it gets very expensive to get this wrong. And we're very focused on this at the moment. And so unfortunately, we're being quite unforgiving about the fines. In addition, we have recognized there's a need to get more information out there. Over the holidays, when things hopefully finally quieten down, my plan, since I'm working over most of the holidays, is to write a VBN that details how to correctly surcharge, how to correctly do non-cash cash discounting, how not to do them, and also to remind clients of the compliance process. And very importantly, remind clients that a merchant's compliance history travels with them. So what we've seen, a number of examples where a merchant has been caught surcharging, the acquirer has decided to terminate the relationship. Because often, not necessarily for the first time, but often for the second time, they terminate the merchant relationship. The merchant then picks up acquiring with a new acquirer and starts surcharging again. If we catch a merchant surcharging, we always do a revisit at a future date. Always. So we go back, find they're surcharging again. Well, if it's repeat violation, there's no waiting period. The fine is instant. And so we see the number of acquirers who's surprised because they've onboarded a merchant, 2 weeks ago or 6 weeks ago, more realistically, with the audit timeframes. They onboarded a new merchant 6 weeks ago and had no idea that the merchant had previous compliance violations with Visa. And so was surprised that they got an instant fine. So, one of those piece of advice there is, when one is onboarding new merchants, is to have that serious conversation with that new merchant. If you're onboarding them via an ISO that's moving to you and they're bringing their merchants, make sure the ISO is aware of that. An ISO changing from one acquirer to another, again, just like a merchant, doesn't remove that ISO's compliance history. And we will follow them if we believe that the move is a result of evading capture and detection of non-compliant models. So yeah, there'll be a VBN coming, which I think will really help.
It will. And I think I guess, interesting follow-up here is that now we've always been seeing this trend of states authorizing and legalizing surcharging, and we're starting to see a different trend. We're starting to see a different trend of junk fee laws that are being passed, where they're looking for transparency, but there's also a question of how does it affect surcharging. Specifically, we had California come out. I believe we had Minnesota recently come out with some new laws. New York came out with a junk fee law that, for all purposes, said you cannot surcharge anymore.
Yeah.
How is Visa handling the change in how things are coming out with these new junk fee laws?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. Minnesota and California wrote their laws in such a way to promote transparent pricing, but also in a way that said, essentially, paying with a card is a choice. Therefore, whilst you're making that choice, you are opening yourself to surcharging, and surcharging becomes legitimate, which as a consumer and as a resident of California was disappointing. But I understand that's how they did it. New York was very straight down the line. The price you see is the price you pay. Obviously, not including sales tax, which is a very convenient carve out for themselves. But yeah, we'd rather that it wasn't so legally complex. And we'd rather that there was kind of like a identical stance across the states. But we also accept that these states have become kind of bellwethers for consumer sentiment over additional charges. The New York law very much focused on pricing at merchants, but it did go all the way down to things like convenience fees when one is, purchasing tickets for a concert or a game. And I mentioned when we were in DC recently, I went to buy a car recently, and the merchant at the last minute tried to add a $4,000 fee that had never been disclosed anywhere during the buying process. And I was able to cite SB 470, the new California transparent pricing law, and have that fee removed. But it was a $4,000 fee for something that none of their website, at no point did the salesperson mention until literally I went to sign on the line to make the purchase. So, we'd rather that we just get compliance with our rules and that consumers get transparent pricing, but we also understand in some instances, and New York was a particularly egregious model. We saw a mass deployment of non-compliant models. You really couldn't even avoid them in New York. Our CEO got illegally surcharged, by illegally, I mean against Visa's rules, surcharged 3 times running by a merchant in our building in New York. And on every occasion, we were told the merchant has fixed it. They're not doing it anymore. And then we came, find the embarrassment of our CEO finding out it literally happened to him again at the same location. So we started sending in mystery shoppers, like our own staff from the building, to validate. Before we told him it had been fixed, we would send our own staff there to make sure. That was an instance where 5 separate occasions we found the same merchant violating our rules, and it was driven by the ISO. The ISO was hiding signage, then hiding the surcharge on the transaction receipt. Suddenly it disappeared. So it was still being applied. You just couldn't see it anywhere. Apart from the fact, unless you made a cash transaction and then a card transaction of the same item, that's the only way you could see you were being surcharged. And again, not compliant with our rules, but that was the depth that the merchant was, and the ISO, in fact, was clinging onto that model. And, you can't imagine that consumer examples like that didn't feed into the way the state changed its law. And in fact, in New York, they have the ability to report a merchant to the state for what they now deem as consider illegal pricing practices. So the ramifications of doing that actually go beyond visa enforcement. They could go down to suddenly a merchant not having trouble getting their business license renewed because they've had so many pricing complaints against them. So it's a sign of the times. It's unfortunate, but I think it helps our mission. But we'd rather we could just do the enforcement and we don't see a bunch of state laws changed in various different ways.
Absolutely. And as you said, you have to comply with the most strict rule or regulation that is there for that state. So if Visa says you can do it, that doesn't mean you can do it in New York or the other states that say you cannot.
Yeah.
Which,
yeah. And a good
complex.
example of how, yes, yeah, exactly. And so a good example of how we've sort of, when we talk about these surcharge solutions that are out there, when ISOs register now with us, we ask them a few questions like, how do you prevent a debit card being surcharged? And what we're looking for is that they use bin logic. So, and they're not reliant on the minimum wage cashier trying to determine, is that a debit card? Is it a credit card? We've also seen the confusion with this debit or credit issue. When you present a debit card and they say debit or credit, which they really mean PIN or signature. And it's just a routing choice. It's still a debit card. So using the term credit, we had several ISOs think, well, if they press credit, then that's a credit card. No, it's still a debit card. They just opted to select PIN, signature rather than PIN. So, all those sort of, we ask that question. We ask, how do you ensure you don't go over the 3% cap that we put in place? And again, we're looking for system logic to do that. And another one is, how do you ensure that this functionality cannot be activated by a merchant in states where surcharging is illegal? So we're looking for some sort of systematic block there. Now, at this point, we're not forcing that. But to be honest, if it's not there, it's a compliance trap. And, we don't expect merchants to be experts on Visa rules, but we do expect everyone selling them a solution about point of sale acceptance, especially when that solution does discount offers, cash discounting, or surcharging. We expect that solution to be compliant. And I expect the person selling that solution to be knowledgeable and compliant with our rules. And that's very much what our enforcement has been focused on.
Absolutely. So I did have one email so far that chimed in with a question for you. So I hope I got enough information from them to allow you to answer this. But the question was, how do surcharging rules interact with Visa transactions in a wallet? So can one surcharge and who is responsible for the rules, especially a third-party wallet per affiliate? So not just Apple, Google, PayPal.
So that's a great question. So generally, if the transaction that runs over Visa rails is the one we're focused on. If it's a closed loop acceptance mark, like Apple Pay, but it's funded by a Visa card, Visa, the transaction we see that we're focused on is the Visa transaction that maybe it's back-to-back funding. If the merchant is surcharging at that point, we may not have visibility into that because we only know that a transaction has been drawn from the funding card to fund the wallet transaction. So unless it's a general purpose wallet and Visa is facilitating the actual purchase transaction itself, we don't really have visibility into that part. But nonetheless, it's still, by sort of proxy, our rules would apply to that as well. We just may not have the evidence to enforce it directly at the point of sale. But we also know that most merchants that accept wallets also accept regular Visa cards. And therefore, if we don't see it in the wallet transaction, we'll certainly likely see it in the direct Visa transaction.
Perfect. So just as a reminder again to everybody that's watching, if you do have a question that you would like answered, feel free to reach out to your respective firm. And please just understand too that we'll pass it along to Robert. It is the holiday season. And so we do want to give him a little bit of time to get back to us and not have to interrupt any time and efforts he may be making over the holidays. But with that, we want to say thank you so much for joining today. In the upcoming days, you will receive a recording of this webinar that you can share. And we will also be sending a survey via email we want to encourage you to give us any feedback you have, as well as we're wanting to do more webinars in the future. So your feedback would be very helpful. One last time, thank you, Robert. We really appreciate you being here, especially right before the holidays and the craziness that comes with it. We hope everyone has a great day. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.